Hello, everyone. This is Ashley Davis. I am the Director of Partnerships from Darkness to Light, and I'm super excited about this evening's discussion. As you begin to log in, please share this information and invite your community. Hope your Tuesday has been amazing. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to get Kevin in. He's currently joining. Again, you probably didn't hear at the very beginning. I'm Ashley Davis. I'm the Director of Partnerships at Darkness to Light, and I'm super excited about this discussion tonight. We are going to dive in and unpack some things that many people may feel uncomfortable addressing, but we are going to go ahead and address these things. Bear with me just a moment. All right, we're trying to get Kevin on. I'm not sure what's going on, but we're going to see if we can get him on. In the meantime, while we are waiting, if you do have questions throughout this discussion, please put your questions in the comment section. Let's see here. I apologize, you all, for the technical difficulties. Trying to get this together. All right, Kevin, I sent another invite. Let's see if you get that one. Everybody cross your fingers. Yay!
Hello.
How are
Hello,
you?
Ashley.
How are
Can
you?
you hear me? I'm doing
I
great.
can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Awesome sauce. Thank you so much for joining us
Thank you for having me.
this discussion. I'm super excited to have you. I've heard so many great things about you from different people on the Darkness to Light team. And I've had an opportunity to follow you on social media for quite some time. And I am so impressed with your consistency. And I'm so impressed with how you are the bridge between the lack of awareness and the willingness to learn. That was something that I read, on the 12 project. And I was like, you know what? He's so right. Like, the bridge is important, and you are definitely that bridge. So I'm grateful that you're joining us tonight for this discussion. I am going to give you a few moments to just introduce yourself to the audience tonight. We have a few guests already joining us tonight. So I would love for you to introduce yourself, introduce the 12 project, and anything else that you would like for us to know. And then we're going to dive right into the discussion.
All right. Thank you, Ashley. I'm such a big fan of yours as well and the work that you're doing. Thank you so much for having me in this time, in this space. I do consider this space sacred. I am Kevin McNeil. For those who do not know me, I'm a former special victim detective, former police officer here in Atlanta, Georgia. I became a police officer in 1998. And when I became a police officer, I was simply shocked. I wasn't ready for what I saw. I saw so much violence and so much trauma on our streets and our neighborhoods and our communities. And I always had the question, where's this coming from? And so 8 years into patrolling the streets and seeing murders and rapes and robberies and all this crime, in particular African-American communities, because that's where I was assigned at the time, I had questions. But when I became a special victims detective and I started investigating child abuse crimes, child molestation crimes, and learning about trauma, it all made sense. And so I began to put the pieces together, like people that I was investigating as young victims of childhood abuse. A couple of years later, I was seeing them on the other side of the police precinct charged with violent crimes. And so they went from victim, and not saying everybody goes that route, but some of them went from victims to violent crimes. And I started wondering, what if we got in front of this? And so in 2017, about 2015, I started really pushing the issue with my police department, asking them, could we learn more about trauma? Could you train us? Because I was never trained in trauma as a police officer. And essentially what happened was I was like the #1 detective in our agency, handling most of the major cases, and said, well, essentially we don't pay you to care for victims. We pay you to lock people up and solve cases, right? And so that really got to me. Being a victim myself. And so in 2017, I turned my badge in, I turned my gun in, and I quit. And I resigned from the police department. I started an organization called the 12 Project, with the major aim was to educate people on the effects of abuse. Because my thing was that we had to take this conversation about abuse out of the courtrooms in the classroom, and we had to put it into the communities where the people were being affected by it the most. And so that's why I started the 12 Project. And it was inspired by scripture, actually, Matthew 10:1-2, when it said Jesus calls his disciples together and he gave them power over abusive spirits. And I thought that was amazing, that the disciples' major responsibility and accountability was to heal people from abuse. And so that's why I named it the 12 Project. And the goal was to educate 12 million people and raise $12 million toward this effort to people who are already doing it. So that's the 12 Project in a nutshell. 12 also, for those who don't know, when I was 12 years old, I was kidnapped and raped while walking home from school and had to fight for my life. I fought my attacker, ran all the way home and never told anybody. Actually told my mom that I had been robbed. But I showed up with no shirt, no shoes, and they could tell something happened, but I didn't want to talk about it. I kept it in for all those years, even while being a police officer. So 12 is a significant number in that regard. And 12 also represents justice. 12 people sit on the jury. There are 12 hours in a day, so it represents renewal and justice. So that's why I started the 12 Project, to educate the public.
Wow, that is incredible. And you touched on so many different things. The fact that, you know, we don't pay you to care about people. We pay you to lock them up.
Yeah.
You know, when you hear something like that, it really makes you wonder, like, the posture of someone's heart. And what is it that, you know, why is it not important for us to care about people?
Yeah.
You know, and something similar, you know, maybe not that exact phrase, but growing up in a Black family, Black household, I am biracial.
Yeah.
And, but I grew up in an African-American family.
Yeah.
And so I've embraced that culture my entire life.
Yeah.
And so something that I'm familiar with, and I'm sure you're familiar with, and I'm sure anyone else who grew up in a Black family can relate to the phrase, what goes on in our house stays in our house.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is something that's something that is like all across the board. Of course, it is for child sexual abuse.
Oh, yeah.
It is for mental illness. It is for anything that family does not want to get out. Something that could possibly bring shame to that family.
Yeah.
And so I grew up in that culture, or in that environment, where I did not have the freedom or the liberty to say, hey, this horrific thing happened to me. And I did not feel, number one, that I could say anything. Yeah. And then if I did say something, I did not feel that I had a support system that would even care, that would even do anything, that would even advocate for me. Yeah. And in my own personal experience, I experienced child sexual abuse from 12 to 19 years old by a family member. Wow. And it wasn't until I was 29, 30 when I was able to actually disclose and talk about it. Wow. And to live with that type of pain and live with that type of shame of something that is not even your fault. No. It's not even something, it's not a burden that you should be carrying, but you do because no one tells you that you don't have to. Yeah. No one tells you that it's not your fault. Yeah. No one says this should not have happened to you. You know, and so it's amazing to me. I always say that there's a new, and I feel like I don't even want to say a new generation, but there is this new awakening that I think victims and survivors, this voice that they have now, where they feel like, you know what, I don't have to be oppressed. Yeah. I don't have to sit in silence. I don't have to remain a victim of this pain. I can use my voice. I can do the work to heal, even though I didn't inflict the wounds. Yeah. You know, I can do the work to heal from this, and I'm deserving to be whole. Yeah. You know, so what has your experience been like, you know, with that whole, what goes on in our house stays in our house?
Oh yeah, that's a culture. And like I said, with the law enforcement agency who told me what they told me, the culture of the law enforcement agent was to respond to things and not heal the problems behind what was causing the symptoms in our society and culture. And a lot of times we respond to symptoms in our culture and not the root problem. what I've discovered is that abuse is the root cause of every major problem in our society and our culture. And so what happens in the house does not stay in the house. It goes into the community. It's absorbed by your body, right? It's no incident or coincidence that Black African Americans suffer in every major category when it comes to health, when it comes to mental health, physical health, psychological health, emotional health. And the common denominator between all of those negative outcomes is that African Americans, we do not talk about our problems, our issues, particularly things that happen within our home. And one thing you said is that a lot of times it's inflicted upon us by those we know, those we trust, those we love, and we're told and we're taught to respect. And so what happens is that we hold the child. Now think about this, and I want people to think about this. We hold children responsible to stop their own abuse. Because until the child says something, the abuse continues. And if and when that child says something, now the child is made responsible for the whole family outcome. Like, you broke up the family. What you said is going to cause this to happen, that to happen. Nobody pays attention to what the person did to the child. They put all the pressure on the child not to tell. And now so children remain silent. And as a result of that, it affects us on every level. It affects us on our relationships, because as we grow up as children, we learn not to trust. We learn not to actually make ourselves vulnerable to other people. And so you start talking about affecting Black love, Black relationships, Black child rearing, African American community. So it has a direct effect on the upbringing. It has a direct effect on our health. It has a direct effect on our mental illness. It has a direct effect upon our ability to concentrate and plan for our future. And so I often tell people, when a child is abused, they instantly go into survival mode. If there's no community to support that child, what that child ends up doing is staying in that survival mode. And I often tell people, you cannot teach success principles to a survival brain, because a survival brain is constantly thinking about survival and not success. So you start seeing in African American communities the effects of what's not said happening in every area of our lives. So silence is deadly on so many levels, not just a physical level, but it's deadly. And so because the abuse is so distant from the outcome, oftentimes what happens is that we look at the outcome, the violence in our communities, right? The health outcomes in our communities, the low economic things in our communities, and we don't put it together with the things that happened to us in the past. We're carrying trauma from our ancestors, you know, who taught us not to be boisterous or outspoken, because in those days they helped us survive. And so we taken something that helped us survive, and now we've taken it and used it as a survival tool, and we've made it into a culture. And we don't see the connection that is happening in our communities, because we see it's so disconnected from the problem. All we see is the symptoms.
Yeah, that's so good. Oh my gosh, you just said a mouthful. That was so rich. That entire mentality, because we are descendants of trauma. You know, African Americans, because we are, that entire mentality of surviving, I think that mentality is what has been passed down from generation to generation. And like you said, when our ancestors were enslaved, they kept quiet for survival, you know, and they kept quiet because they wanted the family to stay together, you know, and you allowed the master to do whatever he wanted to do to your daughter or your son or your child, or whomever, because you wanted to stay together. And you told that child, don't say anything, because if you do, you know, you're going to risk us being separated. We may never see you. You may get killed. And so it was for survival. But it's that mindset that has been passed down from generation to generation.
Exactly.
And we're dealing, the most heartbreaking thing for me is that I am telling the same exact story that my mom told, and that my grandmother told, and that my great-grandmother told about sexual abuse. And I'm tired. I mean, I'm tired of telling that story. And so someone posed the question, like, how do you break the cycle? And I know for me, it begins with, number one, admitting, like, this is something that has happened to me within my family. And I named my abuser, and all of that backlash that you were talking about, I received it. I was accused of breaking up the family. My abuser ended up dying a week after I disclosed, and I was blamed for that. And people hated me, still do to this day. And that's okay. They can hate me. You know, I have a lot of people that love me. And so that's okay. They can deserve the hate. But for me, it was a matter of owning my experience, doing the work myself to go to therapy, to find the resources that I needed to get the healing that I wanted and needed and was deserving. And then since she was able to communicate, what was going to happen was the things that happened to me, she's not going to experience that. I am going to do everything that I can to make sure that she doesn't. And that means that I have conversations with her, uncomfortable conversations, just like I talk to her about drugs, just how I talk to her about mental health. I talk to her about emotional health. I talk to her about her sexuality. I talk to her about everything that matters in her life. And we have very deep, consistent conversations. It's not a let's have the birds and the bees conversation one time and, you know, you're on your way. No, we're having consistent communication. And as she grows, she's getting more information. She's getting more intel on how to approach certain aspects of her life. And I think that one of the ways that we can begin to break the cycle is to, number one, admit that it is happening. And address the fact that it is possibly happening in our own family. And we talk about the importance of taking a risk and being courageous. We say that often. And people may not recognize how much courage and how much of a risk it is to actually speak those words to say that I have been sexually abused and it has happened within my family. It is such a courageous move. And it is a move that individual, you don't know the outcome. You don't know how people will respond. You don't know what they're going to say, if you're going to have support or if you're going to be on this journey alone. But I guarantee you, in my personal experience, it has been a risk that is worth taking every step of the way.
Definitely.
Because if I can prevent it from happening to my child and her friends, because when her friends come over and hang out, we're having the conversation. We're talking about these things, you know, and I'm talking to their parents about these things, and not to be judgmental and say or teach them that you should be parenting this way, but I'm letting them know when your child is at my house, these are the rules that I have. We have open doors in our home. We don't close doors. Just for safety, just to make sure that everything is on the up and up. And so I communicate a lot. And I think that when we begin to communicate and begin to take some, you know, have some courage and say, we're going to dive into this conversation and unpack this, I think that's when we'll begin to see that cycle breaking.
And I totally agree with you. And I often ask people or tell people the best way to silence a ghost is to listen to it. Right? That's the best way to get rid of a ghost, is to listen to it, because most ghosts want to be heard. So you have the ghosts from the past. You cannot silence trauma, even if the victim becomes silenced. Trauma will show itself in different ways, and oftentimes it will show itself in destructive ways. It comes out in behavior, and that's one of the things they didn't teach me as a law enforcement officer, that to look for these behavior changes, because trauma can be heard, right? And so those behavior changes, even in my life, I went from a quiet kid, reserved kid, to a kid now who was fighting, a kid who had bad grades, a kid who didn't appear to be comfortable around anybody. And here's what I also like to tell people: if I can't be vulnerable in my own house, where can I be vulnerable? So if I cannot tell this pain that's inside of me, and as a child, it's confusing. It's a child, the person who's supposed to be protecting you and loving you, is the one who's doing the harm to you. And so oftentimes I tell people, you know, if we're going to stop this generational curse, we have to have a conversation about, because this ghost is going to continue to haunt us if we remain silent, because trauma has ways to speak. And if it isn't heard, it will speak in destructive ways. It'll speak in the ACEs. We talk about adverse childhood experiences, how actual trauma, unresolved trauma, affects the health. You know, lead people to have more inclined to heart disease, cardiovascular disease, cancers, and mental illness, and all sorts of sicknesses. And so what we talk about, stopping the generational curses, we have to get into this conversation often, and we have to be intentional about it. I tell people about the 3 I's. We have to be intentional, right? We have to make it important, and we got to measure the impact that we're having. We got to see that we're having some type of impact, and if it's not working, put together something that does work. And so we must understand that trauma is now speaking to us, even in our current society. You turn on the news, trauma is speaking to us. And so what we end up doing, though, we end up treating the symptoms and not the problem, right? We end up medicating the symptoms, coping with the symptoms. And often what I tell people, and I get very passionate about making this part of the educational culture, that we tell kids what not to put in their bodies, but we don't teach them how to protect their bodies. The one thing they come to earth with, right? Yeah. The one thing they own, one thing is that their possession, we don't teach them how to protect it and how to make other people protect those boundaries. And so a lot of times we actually cope or we ignore. And so I get a lot of feedback when I go to churches, and I tell them you can't pray or praise your way out of this. Right. So you have to confront this, right? You have to have conversations about this. And what we have done as African Americans, we have learned to cope and ignore and learn to be silent and pretend that it's going to go away. And oftentimes when people get upset with me when I say this, we always talk about what they did to us, but we never talk about how can we correct and heal from what they did to us or are doing to us. So we have to have that conversation. And what about us? You know, we can point the finger all we want to, but if we don't look at what we're doing, because what ends up happening, we end up turning that trauma and abuse upon ourselves and upon those who look like us in our own communities. And so that's why you start seeing the degradation of women. You hear it in our songs, you see it in our music, you see it in the culture, because we're not talking about it. Ends up showing itself in many different forms. And oftentimes those forms are destructive. And because we're trying to cope and ignore it, we end up praising abuse rather than dealing with it.
Gosh, you just said a mouthful there.
Yeah.
It's so good. And you touched on the topic of church.
Yeah.
And the whole pray it away.
Yeah.
I grew up as a pastor's kid.
Yeah.
So I'm familiar with a lot of that.
Yeah.
Where it's like, I have things that I need to have a conversation. With someone to be able to navigate through. So, I've heard that many times. We do have a few questions that I want to put out there.
Okay.
One of the questions is, it's a question for you and I, or either one of us. It says, can you elaborate more as a previous officer, as a male sexual abuse survivor, and school social work? Let's see here. I'm sorry, it won't let me see the entire question. Okay. So it's saying to elaborate more as a previous officer. Let's see. Just Hefner, can you give me a brief version of the question? I'm not able to see the full question. So we'll circle back around to that. Another question is, I'm a child welfare social worker. How can me and my colleagues best support child survivors, assuming the abuser was a family member?
Wow. That's a great question. I think one of the things we need to do, and I talk about this element of teamwork, a lot of us who do this work don't work together as teams. We often know our tasks, but we don't have the same mission. First of all, we have to make the mission healing. We got to make the victim the focus of everything we do. And oftentimes, particularly from a law enforcement perspective, we focus so much on putting somebody in jail, but not bringing healing into the family, into the victim's lives. And I often equate that to, dealing with the abuser and not healing the victim is almost like releasing a man from prison, but leaving them in his prison clothes, right? You set them free from one aspect of what they're dealing with, but you leave them in a condition where they still see themselves as a prisoner. So as social workers, I would say get together with your law enforcement, develop a team with your multidisciplinary team, and develop a team, an educational team, where you can actually educate families on the effects of abuse. Because one thing I understood as a detective is that if I educated that family on the process and what would happen, what to expect as a result of what they're reporting, a lot of them came on board with me. And a lot of them said, you know what? I would not have my child suffer her whole life for 5 minutes. 5 minutes, right? Because all it takes is a couple of minutes to destroy a whole life. And so families was like, when I understood and I started telling them about trauma, right? So oftentimes when we do our job, we go in and we do the work, but we don't educate the people who is affected. So they don't know what to expect out of what has happened. So we may put someone in jail, but now they don't understand why their daughter or their son is acting out in the home, or they don't understand why their daughter or son has quit their favorite sports activity, or why the child is running away, or why the child is being defiant. And oftentimes what happens is we end up judging the behavior rather than asking, why is the behavior there? And so I tell people the eyes are great judges, but they're horrible listeners. And so until we learn how to have compassion, we can't connect with the victim. And if we can't connect to the victim, we're telling the victim they can't communicate with us. And so silence becomes part of their defense mechanism. And so when we put a victim in a culture where they don't feel like they can be heard, then what they end up doing, silence becomes a badge of honor. Like, I took this, I can hold on to it, and they become proud of the moment, but they don't understand that silence is actually killing them. I often tell people to be healed, you have to be heard. And so when we stop listening to people, or giving space for people to tell their stories or tell about their trauma, we're actually aborting the healing process. And so we're making people not just into victims over again, we're actually keeping them in that victim state. So we have to learn. So as social workers, talk to people who do the work, because the law enforcement officer, no one trained me on trauma. They put me in a cubicle and told me go arrest people for committing sex crimes. But nobody told me what to look for, what to listen for. Nobody told me that this vicarious trauma, by doing this work, is going to affect me as well. And so people who do that, we have to consistently educate ourselves. We have to start book clubs. You know, go to the office. I used to do that as a detective. I used to bring books into the office and sit them on the desk and say, hey, we need to read this book and discuss. But nobody wanted to do it. And so I used to leave books on other detectives' desks. Start the conversation where you are. And then that conversation will bleed out into the community, and you'll see the effects of it. And not only that, you'll be able to measure your effectiveness, because you'll start seeing changes in the work that you're doing. So as a social worker, yes, you want to be intentional.
That is so good. I love the idea of creating a multidisciplinary team, creating your own task force.
Yeah.
You know, this is not one of the things that we talked about today in our staff meeting at D2L was empathy. And we talked about, you know, CSA is important to us for different reasons. And even though it's important to us, it may not be the top priority for someone else. And so what is it that we can do to change, you know, to make it matter to them? How do we get them to care enough to want to do something more than just arrest? You know, dig a little bit deeper. And get to the root of the behavior and not just observe the action.
And one of the ways we do that is by making things measurable. We love with accountability, right? We have the accountability with measurement, which means that, okay, we've been talking about certain things for a certain amount of years. Racism. We've been talking about hatred. We've been talking about healthcare. Okay, we've been talking about all these things. Have we moved the needle? And so when I often talk to churches, I say, hey, we got church on every corner. We've been preaching and praising and praying for people, but has it helped? And because we're not measuring the effects of what we're doing, we're not improving what we're doing. And so what we have to do is we have to put programs in place, and we have to actually see that we can measure. I often use the acronym HOPE. H stands for we have to have heightened awareness of abuse, which means we have to make sure people understand that this is happening every single day. We have to have open dialogue. We have to, the O is for open dialogue. We have to be able to discuss these things out in the open. And then we have to provide learning opportunities. We can't wait till people come to us. We have to go to them. And then we have to evaluate our progress, the E. That's hope. If we're going to bring hope in our culture, that's what we have to do. We have to find out, and our churches get mad at me, is the laying on of hands and pushing people to the ground working, right? Is the put oil on people's forehead working, right? Is the praying working, right? And I often tell them times, now, you got to listen to this. If people are starting getting sick, there's constantly crime in your communities, and people are still attending your services, you got to say, what are we not doing that's causing the change? And we can't leave change to chance. We have to be intentional. We have to. And if we're not measuring what we're doing, we're failing at what we're doing, because we're not seeing what we need to do to improve and bring change to what the problem is. And oftentimes we just do things consistently and consistently to say we're doing them, but we don't know if they're working or not. So we have to develop programs within our communities, our churches, our family. Is this working? And here's another thing. People laugh at me when I say this. Bring back the dining room table. The dining room table is the most important piece of furniture in the house, right? Because if I can sit down with the family, right, then you start to hear how the day went. You start to really, and kids learn to trust the culture, that this is a culture of welcoming me, a culture where I can be vulnerable, a culture where I feel protected, right? We have to bring the family back together, particularly African-American families. And that's one thing I tell African-Americans. We have to hold people accountable. This music that's degrading women is adding to child sexual abuse. This music that's promoting violence is adding to it. We have to hold people accountable and say, if you continue to speak to our children in negative ways, derogatory ways, and put out energy that's negative to our children's well-being, we will not support you. And so that's what I mean by that accountability piece.
And with that accountability piece, we can't be scared to be held accountable.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
You know, as an adult, it's so amazing to me, the awareness that children have.
Oh, yeah.
And how they know more than we give them credit for. You know, and I remember the importance of dinner.
Yeah.
Because not only was it an opportunity for you to check in with your loved ones, but it also served as a safe space for you to be heard.
Oh, yeah.
Even if you weren't talking about anything important, you know, it puts you in the frame of mind to where you're like, okay, these are my people, you know, and I'm in a safe place so I can talk about whatever has happened in my day. Yeah. And it's a safe space for me to talk about that in some families.
Yeah. And also it allows those who are familiar with you to know if something is bothering you. And a lot of times we're so disconnected from ourselves that we can't hear other people's pain, right? Because when I've been traumatized, I shut down my ability to hear and listen. And so I become so concerned and so walled off that I can't hear other people's pain. So you're right. When we come together and we know there's a time to be together, there's a certain element where you can actually gauge something's going on I don't know about.
Yeah.
And so it leads us to ask the questions, and even if the person do not tell it, that they're speaking to you through their actions or their inactions. And so we have to learn how to listen for abuse and listen for trauma rather than look for it. Because if you're looking for abuse, oftentimes you're not going to see it. Or if you see it, you're going to judge the behavior that's the result of the trauma from the abuse, and you're going to make the victim feel even worse about being abused and not even helping them. So you're going to make us quiet even more. So that's been my experience in the African American community, is that I got punished when my behavior changed, but nobody asked me why it changed. Right? Nobody asked me why I quit track, a sport that I was very good at, was getting scholarship offers at. And I'll never forget this. I'll never forget my track coach invited me over for Bible study, and he molested me, and I told him to take me home. By this point, I'd already been raped at 12. I was about 14, 15. And so he came over to my house one day, and I heard him downstairs, and he was trying to convince my mom to make me come back to the track team. And so I came downstairs, and I said, "Get out of my house." And I'll never forget, my mom looked at me and said, "Boy, you don't talk to adults like that. Get your butt back upstairs before you get whooped." But she never asked me, why did my son quit something that he loved? And that happens so much. Yeah.
You're so right. My behavior changed in my family, and the way that it changed for me is that my abuser, I was in very close proximity with him on a consistent basis. Mm-hmm. And I began to misbehave at school because my punishment was that I would have to be under my mother wherever she was. I had to go with her. And so I started getting in trouble on purpose, just so that I would not be alone with my abuser, so that I would have to be with my mom. And my mother, it never clicked for her. Like, why has Ashley changed so much? Like, what's going on? Why doesn't she want to be home by herself? Yeah. Or why doesn't she want to be home? Why does she not want to be around this person? Excuse me. It never clicked for her that maybe there is a deeper problem. One of the questions was, how do you work through abuse that's happening at the dinner table? And for me, it was, I didn't feel like I had the support, or I didn't feel like I was empowered to even say anything at the dinner table. So like you said, you don't talk to adults that way. You know, you're supposed to be respectful of that adult. You're supposed to mind your own business. You're not even supposed to be listening to adult conversations. Like, if we really want to take it back to, you know, what grandma and mom and them said, you know, you ain't even supposed to be listening to our adult conversations. And you're definitely not supposed to be engaged or involved in them. And so the question is, what are you supposed to do? You know, when the abuse is happening right there amongst that immediate family, how do you, how do you find your voice? How do you... Oh, go ahead.
But one of the things is, another question is, what happens if the abuser is sitting at the table with you, right? And so for me, I'm talking about the normacy, making this a normal condition that we eat together, we have family members together. So what happens is, if I don't show up at that dinner table, then somebody at that table should know something is wrong with Kevin, right? But if the normal act is we don't eat together anyway, I can stay in my room and they just say, that's just Kevin, which oftentimes happens. I never ate dinner with my family. I never came downstairs. I was like this guy where I waited till everybody ate dinner, and I snuck downstairs to eat because I was too ashamed to be in their presence. But nobody questioned that. And I think if we normalize healthy behavior, it'll set us up to more easily recognize unhealthy behavior. So I think we have to set a culture where we're putting ourselves in a position where we letting our children know this is what we do as a family. We talk about our day. We talk about what happened to us. We talk about things that's important to us. And if somebody doesn't join us at the table, there needs to be questions asked as to why. There needs to be some accountability. Going back to that accountability issue, who's accountable for Kevin not showing up, right? We just don't let our children go off and deal with abuse like you and I talk about by themselves, because if we do that, we're going to hold that child responsible not only to stop the abuse, we're going to hold that child responsible for holding a family together that's keeping it secret, right? We're going to hold that child, that young person, accountable for going to school and taking up all these peer pressures, trying to learn, knowing that there's a secret they're holding on to in their family, right? Why isn't Kevin coming to the family reunions, right? Who's at the family reunion that's preventing Kevin from showing up? And so we need to start asking questions. So I love that question. What if abuse is happening at the table? That's a great question, because now you understand, if I don't show up at that table, or if the abuser is sitting at that table, right, it needs to be addressed, because now somebody around that table may pick up on what's happening, right? So if I stop showing up at the table, don't just say Kevin is being defiant or Kevin doesn't want to join us. Ask the question as to why doesn't Kevin show up at the table. So I think the answer to that is to normalize healthy behavior so we can be more easily recognize unhealthy behavior. So, but if we always just do our own thing, children, you know, everybody go their own separate ways, your kid can be suffering in silence and you'll never know. And another thing, the child think you don't even care. And so why tell you, right? If I tell you all I'm going to do is cause problem and harm, you already think I'm a bad kid. So we have to normalize coming together and create an atmosphere, culture where I can be vulnerable. If I can't be vulnerable at home, right? And I often tell detectives when it comes to children making outcries, if that child doesn't make an outcry to someone in the home and makes it outside of the home, that is a clue. That's something, and I tell the social workers, if the outcry didn't come from somebody in the home, that is a clue of the home environment. That child did not feel safe in that home. Exposing or telling, or the person who they may be accusing of this act is the one inside the home. So all these things we have to pay attention to. We have to be able to listen. And so in the African-American community, we've made silent a culture. We made it a badge of honor. You know, this whole don't snitch, don't tell. Our kids listen to that. So they hear that, you know, that old adage, be seen and not heard, right? So we rob kids of their voice from the very beginning, right? It's amazing. We come into the world. We can't walk. We can't hold our head up. But as babies, we exit the womb and come into the world crying. That says something by itself, that God gave us a voice. And that if we silence that voice, we silence our power. And so we need to understand that the voice is the most powerful thing that a person has. And if you take that away from them, they will find alternative ways to speak. And if they don't speak verbally, their bodies will speak negatively for them, dealing with health issues, dealing with learning disabilities, dealing with social interaction problems, the inability to develop healthy and trustful relationships, the inability to develop intimacy with themselves and others. So this affects everything, right? It affects how you work together with your comrades and your co-workers. So abuse needs to be addressed. It cannot be held silent any longer. We're at a state in our lives, in our culture, in our world right now. If we do not address this, we're going to be in trouble, because my idea is that the abuse we see on the day, or the violence we see on the day, is the abuse that we ignored on yesterday. And so what's happening in our culture, we got so many things. Every time something like COVID-19 or the economy comes up, sexual abuse gets pushed way back on the burner even further. We're already not having a conversation. Now we just put things on top of it, and we're burying that conversation even deeper into the ground. And that, like I know, anytime you bury something, it produces something.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. I always say a seed can't grow into anything but what it is.
That's it.
So whatever it's planted, it's gonna blossom. It's gonna bloom.
Yeah.
And so one of the questions that was asked was that I thought was just was amazing. It talks about, if Black parents are often in survival mode, how do we help them address their own emotional needs? And while you were talking about the table, the table can also be hard for that parent who has experienced it. Sometimes they don't see it because they don't want to see it.
Yeah.
Because if they see it at their table in the life of their own child, then that means I have to take a look at myself. And then now I have to dig into my own experience with it. And the reality is, and it's such an alarming, we don't even have a true statistic of CSA in the Black home. Like, we don't have a true statistic.
Yeah, that's my point.
Even when it comes to
ACEs. Yeah, that's my point.
Yes, and even when it comes to ACEs, we're already, just because of our history of trauma, we're already coming into this high. On the scale in comparison to other demographics. And so with ACEs, yes, but the reality is we don't have a true statistic of what it is like, because there are parents who have experienced, there are grandparents that have experienced it that will never ever talk about it. They will take it to their grave. And then they have children who experience it and are alone, because some parents would rather keep quiet and let you figure it out than address their own wounds and address their own traumas.
And you just hit a major point. That's so significant and important. I'm glad that person asked that question, because a lot of times we don't want to talk about it because we've been made to make it keep secret. And so I had a detective who was investigating a case, and he was getting ready to close the case because he said the mother wasn't being cooperative. And I said, hold up a second, let me speak with her. And so when I spoke to the mother, she said, I don't know why y'all making a big deal of this. Why is such a big problem? And she started crying. She said, nobody came to my aid when I was abused. Nobody listened to me. So the woman became really confused and jealous that her daughters were getting attention that she never got as a little girl. And so we must understand that we have to address these issues. We can no longer be silent. And here's the thing that that really amazed me. One day I was sitting down with my mother, and she told me, before I was born, I was at a bus stop, and the guy put me in the trunk and tried to close the trunk. And I kicked my way out of the trunk, and I ran all the way home. And it hit me. I was like, how interesting that the same thing that happened to me happened to my mother. And then I began to wonder, did my mother do the same thing as I did? Did my mother not tell the whole truth? Did something more happen? Was my birth a result of that encounter? And I just don't know. You see, you can't keep silent about trauma. You can, but it's going to cost you. And so that person who asked that question, how do you get these parents? You're going to have to do it in a way we're going to educate. That's why I love Darkness to Light. Education is what got me out of prison. It's what got me out of trauma prison. Because once I learned about trauma, and I learned I wasn't the only one, I learned how to affected my behavior. It taught me that I wasn't a bad person. Something bad happened to me, right? And so now it freed me to research, to venture out, and to become vulnerable, to learn. And so organizations like Dark and Light is so essential to bringing change into the world because of this. I would tell that person, education. Nelson Mandela said something. He said, education is the most powerful tool you can use to change the world. And I often tell people in church, we forget Jesus was a healer, but he was an educator too. And I often get in trouble for this when I say this, but I'm going to say it. Sickness is a business. When you start healing people, you affect the economy. So there are going to be opposing forces who don't want this to happen.
Yeah.
Right? So you have to understand that you're doing something that's transformative. You're doing something that's, I tell people, healing is the highest form of justice. It's the highest form of justice. Right? You can put people in jail, but if you don't go the extra route to heal the victim and their families, you haven't really brought justice to that victim or their families. You've only done partial justice. If we're going to do justice, we have to start having these conversations. We have to start creating environments where this becomes normal, where we talk to our kids, and we have to teach our kids, empower them. We teach them about the parts of the body, but we don't teach them about the importance of protecting boundaries when it comes to their body. And so we're gonna have to get programs like Doctors Like in school, in middle schools. We're gonna have to make it so police departments, you can't become a police officer, or EMT, a paramedic, or a firefighter until you learn about trauma and effective trauma on people. You know, and so it's interesting that we make people go to DUI school to get their license back, but we won't make people learn about trauma and they can just have kids, right? So you can walk out of the hospital with a kid, but no trauma training. But in order to adopt a dog, I don't know about elsewhere, but here in Georgia, they got to come to your house and make sure you got the adequate resources to raise that dog. Right? But we don't do that. But we say children are our priority. We say one thing, but we communicate another thing. And our children are watching this. And so we talk about silence in African American communities, right? You know those sayings. You know, what stays in this house happens in this house. You know, what happens in the house stays in the house. It's not the only one. That one, I brought you into this world. You know, I take you out.
I take you out.
Yeah, you know what I'm saying? So it's those things, right? Children are afraid, right? So, you know, keep crying. I give you something to cry about, right? So children learn from this culture. We have to change the culture. We can't just talk about the problem without changing the culture, because if not, we're on a treadmill, just like I was at the police department. I was up to hearing cases, but it felt like I wasn't moving the needle because, one, we had no measuring tool to see what we was doing was effective. And the fact was we wasn't doing anything. We were just responding to cases. We wasn't educating the public, because here's what I know. When you start educating the public, that same public becomes your jurors who sit on juries during these trials. And once they're educated about trauma and abuse, they can understand the effect that abuse has on our culture, and they can see as a duty and responsibility not only to hold the person accountable, but make that person pay restitution to bring healing to the families, right? And so we need to make people held accountable, because if you abuse somebody and go to jail for, part of your bond is actually paying somebody to bring therapy to that victim and that family, and yourself as an abuser. You know, part of your probation is to get taught by a child advocate center or somebody who's educated on trauma and abuse on what you have really done. And what we'll find out is that person too may have been a victim of abuse themselves.
Yeah. And I think it helps us, like we talked about earlier, with empathy. Yeah. I can empathize with your experience. Yeah. Doesn't mean that you're not accountable for your actions. Yeah. Because there are always consequences for your actions. Definitely. But I can empathize. Yeah. If you've had an experience that is similar to mine. And I know that one of the greatest things and the most humbling thing about being in this position as a director of partnerships is that I get an opportunity to get to know who our partners are, and then begin to think, like, who should our partners be? You know, what other partners should we be connected with? And I know that there was a comment earlier, and I do apologize, everyone. We're not going to be able to get to all the questions during the live, but what I will do is I will go back through and we will answer the questions that you have in the comment section. Or maybe we can do a part 2. Like, this is insightful, and I'm more than open to do a part 2 if you are.
I am.
And
Yeah,
we can
definitely.
get these questions. We
if
can
they
get
want
these
it,
questions
we can definitely
answered.
do it.
But one of the things that we have to really take charge of is this competitiveness. There are so many nonprofits, there are so many organizations that are for prevention. And the reality is there is space for all of us to thrive. There's space for all of us to work. But we have to come together. It's not a competition.
No.
You know, and someone was talking about our curriculum. They used our curriculum as well as someone else's curriculum. And another curriculum was probably more appropriate for a different audience. That is perfect. That is superb. We don't claim to be, we don't claim to know every single thing that there is to know about this. And which is why this position that I have has been about establishing those partnerships. If something is working in your area, if something is working for the demographic of people that you serve, we want to be a part of what you're doing. You know, we're not trying to take on what you're already doing, you know, the demographic that you're serving. We want to partner with you so that we can do whatever it takes to prevent this from happening. And the most powerful thing, the powerful tool that we have is to partner with one another. And if you don't know what to do, even from an individual perspective, if you don't know what to do as someone who is working in a CAC or is working in a school system that it seems like you're the only person that cares about this subject, listen, reach out to those of us that are doing this work. I guarantee you, you are not alone. There are people in your area or in close proximity that is doing something and can be a resource to you. But you have to ask for the help. You have to say, I don't quite know what to do. I don't know what the next steps are. I'm passionate about this, but that's all I have right now. You know, so we have to depend on one another. We have to work together and collaborate in order for this to work, in order for this to be a successful thing. So I'm super excited to be serving in this position. And I'm so grateful for your insight. And I'm thankful that you have been able to use your experiences to help others overcome. Because the reality is, and we know this, and everyone watching knows that some people aren't able to see the other side of trauma. And it's unfortunate and it's unfair, honestly. But you have been able to get to that other side. And you've been able to use that to help other people know that, hey, you can get through this. And more importantly, you can get over it, and you can use it to do some good to help others. So I just want to applaud you for all that you are doing to change the narrative, all that you are doing to save lives. I know that advocates don't hear enough. We do the dirty work, but we don't hear that appreciation enough. And so I want to take this opportunity to thank you for the work that you are doing, and the time and the insight, your experiences, and your transparency that you've given us tonight.
Thank you.
Can you give us details on how people can get in touch with you? I know I can put in the comments
they can
as well.
They can get in contact with me on my website, the12project.com, or they can get in contact with me on my Instagram page, Kevin_McNeil_. Those are the two best ways to get in contact with me. I'm always available for questions. Currently, I'm working on a documentary called Breaking the Deadly Silence, dealing with this very same topic issue that we're talking about. Sexual abuse, silence about it is not just an issue in the African American community, it's an issue in every community, but specifically in the African American community, because we have made silent a culture, not just pertaining to child sexual abuse, about every type of abuse. So domestic abuse, whether it be physical abuse, we have taken away the power of our children. And you know, I like to leave people with this. Jesus was asked the question, who's the greatest in all the kingdom? He brought a child. So that just shows you how important children are. Our future scientists, our future doctors and lawyers, they come in the form of a child. And if we abuse that child, we're destroying our own future. We're destroying our own world. So we have to make it important. We got to be intentional, and we have to be able to measure the impact that we're having with the work that we're doing. We can't just do the work. And like you said, partner is very important. How I would tell people, look at an organization like Darkness to Light and contribute to it. You know, I contribute. If you really are caring about this topic, find a way to contribute to the growth of the organization that's already doing the work. You see, because we can empower Darkness to Light to do so much more, right? We can do our own thing on the side. But if there's an organization, why reinvent the wheel? There's an organization already doing the work, already improving upon what they're doing, already, let's pour into that, right? If we all got the same mission, it should be that way anyway. I can do a different task as long as we got the same mission. And so that's why I love partnering with Darkness to Light. You know, anytime you all call me, I'm there. Anything I can do for you all, just let me know. And this has been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Again, everyone, thank you for joining us tonight for this conversation. I know that some people may have felt a little uncomfortable, didn't quite know what this conversation was going to be like. But I promise you, we're going to give you the best information that we have, and we're going to do it from a judgment-free place. And we're going to answer the questions that you do have. And just know that this is always a safe space for you to ask your questions, for you to engage. And the reality is, if you don't know something, just ask. You know, we're doing a lot of asking with everything that is going on with the injustice of people of color. You know, now there's a lot of conversation about diversity, inclusion, and what that looks like. What should we be doing as an organization? What should we be doing as a corporation? So there are a lot of questions being asked, and it's okay to ask those questions. We should be asking those questions so that we can get the information so that we can do better. So I'm grateful for everyone that has joined tonight. I'll go back through and we'll check out those questions and get some answers for you all. And we will let you know when part 2 will take place. We'll get that on the books and let you all know. So thank you so much for all that you're doing to advocate for our children and communities in your area. Thank you so much. And everyone have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.